Hi, YouTubers, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, unwanted pets and relatives. Mr. Palumbo here, and today we are going to discuss the Civil War. Now, I'd like to discuss three major components that you'll probably find on your test or any test held within the continental United States. And so we are going to discuss the beginning of the war. We are going to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of both sides. We'll touch on some of the people of the Civil War, of course, not all of them, and we'll touch on some of the battles. Of course, not all of them. But first, we need to discuss why the Civil War started. Now, everyone's going to say, "Oh, I know, slavery." Well, yes, slavery. The good old question is, if there wasn't slavery, would there have been a Civil War? No. So obviously, slavery is part of that conversation. But there was also questions of state sovereignty and the role of the federal government. And there's also an identity shift. At the beginning of the Civil War, you were most allegiance, you had most allegiance towards your state. You were a Virginian who happened to be an American. By the time we get to the end of the Civil War, you're an American who happens to be from Virginia. And also, another key influence of the Civil War is, I forgot. I remember now. What I was going to say was another interesting component to the Civil War was this question of the Union. There was a conversation about, well, states are supposed to be sovereign, and so if a state joins the Union, a state should be able to voluntarily leave the Union. That question was solved with the Civil War. Basically, states, once you join, there is no leaving. It's kind of like Hotel California. You can check in anytime you like, but you can never leave. Okay, let's move on to the Compromise of 1850. With the Compromise of 1850, California was admitted into the Union as a free state. Now this shifted the balance of power in the Senate towards the free states, and the southern states began to feel as though they were losing political influence and power in the government. Another portion of the Compromise of 1850, whose architect was Henry Clay, said that stricter federal fugitive slave laws, would be enacted to ensure that fugitive slaves were caught and brought back to the South. The South, as I said before, was already feeling their political power and influence diminish, especially with the election of Republican Abraham Lincoln, who disagreed with the institution of slavery and won the election without carrying a single Southern state. For all intents and purposes, Lincoln was a moderate Republican. He disagreed with slavery, and he disagreed with its expansion towards the West, but he promised the Southerners that he would not abolish the institution altogether. Lincoln's pleas went on deaf ears, and on December 20th, 1860, the first Southern state to secede from the Union was South Carolina. It was soon followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina did not secede until after the attack on Fort Sumter. The first shots fired in the Civil War were on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, by Confederate forces on April 12, 1861. After 34 hours of shelling, the fort finally fell, and Lincoln is quoted as saying, "The last ray of hope for preserving the Union had expired with the fall of Fort Sumter." So before we go any further into the battles and the people, let's talk about strengths and weaknesses. These are things most textbooks will talk about. These are things that you need to know generally on any standard high school, junior high test. the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides going into the war. So let's start with the Union. The Union's strengths are many. However, I've chosen most of the standard strengths that you'll find again in any text. The first one is its industrial base. By 1860, 90% of the entire industrial output of the whole country, North and South, came from the North. That means the North made 90% of all the industrial output. Supplies, wagons, cannons, textiles, farming equipment. All those things came from the North. Another strength was population. The North had 22 million people. Most of those people, about a quarter, lived in urban areas, as opposed to the South's 9 million people. So that was a big advantage for the North. And finally, railroads. Railroads were proving to be very important for combat and modern life. You could travel faster, you can get troops to the battlefield faster, you can get supplies to the battlefield faster, so on and so forth. The North had 22,000 miles of railroad approximately, while the South had only 9,000. And again, this is going to be proven a vital advantage as the war rolled on. Now let's talk about the weaknesses. The first weakness is military leadership. As the war broke out, most of the talented generals were Southern, and so they went to the South. This made it hard in the beginning to develop a strategy, as we'll talk about with General George McClellan. He always was just very timid and very conservative, and it's not until we get to people like Grant where they really took the fight to the Confederates, and that paid dividends later. But in the beginning, they didn't have the kind of military leadership the South had. And this final weakness point could be up for some debate and discussion, but I put lack of conviction. Unlike the South, who had a purpose and believed that they were fighting the second great American Revolution, the second Great War for Independence, the North did not have this sense. Most average Northerners might have been against slavery, but they surely weren't willing or wanting to die and become a martyr for the slavery cause. The North did have quite a influential abolitionist movement, but the average soldier from the North probably could care less what was happening hundreds of miles south with African Americans and their slave owners. So the North did lack this sense of purpose. The Confederates. The Confederate strengths were again their military leaders. Once the war started, most of the talented, competent, successful, even military career generals were from the South. So they went, obviously, to fight for the South. This paid off great for the Confederates, who often had to fight against superior numbers and try to prolong the war long enough to get the North to give up. Unlike the North or the average Northern soldier, the South had a sense of purpose. They were fighting the second great American War. Or, if you go to college down south, as I did, they were fighting the War of Northern Aggression. That's what they call the Civil War down there. Still to this day, 160 years later, it's still the War of Northern Aggression. So they had this sense of purpose. That's a real morale booster, even when you're outnumbered and constantly maybe losing, though the North did not win a lot at the beginning. The South did kind of win in the beginning quite a bit. The sense of purpose really helps give you that will to fight on. And they knew the terrain. Most of the battles were fought in the South where these people lived and grew up and worked, and so they knew the geography a lot better than the northern soldier. Weaknesses are many. I mean, like I said, they didn't have the industry that the North had, so while the North was pumping out guns and cannons and cannonballs and gunpowder and everything, the South really lacked a lot of these supplies and resources. But I would say that the most glaring weakness of the Confederates, and again we can debate this, is their overall lack of population. Again, the South had approximately 9 million people, and we have to remember that a third of those people were slaves. So to fight a very costly war and encounter 30% losses, 40% losses, near 50% losses to your army every battle, you got to replenish those numbers. And the North could do that, the South couldn't, and eventually that was their undoing. Let's move on now to some of the important people of the Civil War. Obviously, this is not an all-inclusive review. There are countless individuals that impacted and influenced the Civil War. We are just going to touch on a few figures here. Most of these figures you will find in textbooks or on a test, regardless of what state you live in. So we can't talk about the Civil War without talking about Abraham Lincoln. Now, we could have a whole presentation on this man alone, and maybe that is something I can look into in the future, but just a few things to know about him is he was born in Kentucky. A lot of people think, well, he's from Illinois. Well, he worked and lived in Illinois, but he was actually born in Kentucky. He's a self-educated man. His political career wasn't that extensive. He did a couple, he served in the House in the state of Illinois, and he also served in the U.S. House in 1840, and he was elected the 16th president in 1860, and the Republican Party went with him because they considered him a moderate. He didn't push for the abolition of slavery everywhere, but he certainly didn't think it should expand to the West. All right, let's talk about George McClellan. He was the first to bat, if you will. He organized the Army of the Potomac once the war got started. He's mostly known for being too timid against the rebels. He would often have the Confederate forces on the ropes, and he just never would really go in for the kill. He was a very conservative general, and eventually he angered Lincoln so much that Lincoln replaced him. And he was replaced by Ambrose Burnside in 1862. Now let's talk about Ulysses Grant. He led many successful campaigns in the West, and we'll talk about some of those. He's known for his aggressive fighting style. I mean, he really took it to Lee and his forces and other forces. He really had a reputation for a very aggressive fighting style. So much so that they nicknamed him No Surrender Grant. And it is General Lee who surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox in 1864 in Virginia. All right, let's look at some of the Confederate figures. We've got Jefferson Davis. Again, he served in the Mexican-American War. He was the senator of Mississippi at the time of the secession and the Civil War, right when it broke out. And a lot of people don't know that he was originally against secession, but like many Southerners, once the writing was on the wall, he chose to go with his home state and he left the Union as well. And he was elected the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. Next, we have Robert E. Lee. Lee was the son of a Revolutionary War hero. He was the former West Point commandant. He led the Army of North Virginia very successfully up until about Gettysburg is kind of the turning point, but up until then he would often win with less forces and less supplies. He was originally offered to lead the Union forces, the Army of the Potomac, but he declined. He said he couldn't raise up arms against his home state of Virginia. All right, let's talk about Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson joined the Confederate Army once Virginia seceded. He was a school teacher before that. He was known for his aggressive, tenacious fighting style. He got the nickname Stonewall at the First Battle of Bull Run, where a soldier famously said, "Look at Jackson standing there like a stone wall." So he was very courageous, even under fire. He had great courage, showed great courage and fortitude. He was very influential in most of the Confederate campaign. He won many battles for the Confederacy. He was killed by friendly fire in 1863. And Lee is famously quoted as saying, Stonewall Jackson has lost his left arm, I have lost my right. So it was a major blow for the Confederacy once Stonewall Jackson was killed. All right, I thought I'd throw in some honorable mentions here. These individuals may or may not be found on a test or in your textbook, but they certainly were important and influential figures during the Civil War era. The first one is James Longstreet. He was a Confederate general known for his defensive tactics. He was an integral part of the Battle of Gettysburg. George Pickett is the general that led the infamous Pickett's Charge at Gettysburg, which was ultimately a failure and helped the Union secure victory there. David Farragut is a Union naval officer who helped win victories at New Orleans and the siege at Vicksburg. Frederick Douglass and John Brown are both abolitionist figures. Frederick Douglass is an ex-slave who escaped to the North, became well-educated and a very powerful speaker, and ultimately became the figurehead for the abolitionist movement. John Brown was the more militant arm of the abolitionist movement. He believed in using violence to free the slaves. He attempted to raid an armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which was unsuccessful. He was eventually hung and died somewhat a martyr for the cause. And then finally we have two Union generals. I kind of wanted to give you an idea of the succession of how the Union generals kept trickling down, if you will, as Lincoln kept trying to find somebody to fight. So Ambrose Burnside replaced McClellan, and then finally Hooker replaced Burnside, and eventually Grant gets his shot, and it is a success in the end. All right, let's talk now about the battles of the Civil War. Again, I want to caution you, this is just a rough sketch. Obviously, this is not all of the battles, or else this would be a very long presentation. These are just a review of some of the most significant battles of the Civil War. So let's go with numero uno, First Battle of Bull Run. This took place just outside of Washington, D.C. It was a big event. Everybody brought their families out. They had picnics watching the great battle. They thought it was just going to be the greatest thing ever until chaos broke loose and a lot of the picnic goers were ending up running away from the carnage. It's ultimately a Confederate victory. And what you need to know about this battle is this signaled to the North that the war wasn't going to be short or easy. The South meant business, and this was going to take a little more time and effort than previously thought. All right, Battle of Antietam. This was fought in Maryland at Antietam Creek. The Union lost 12,000 men. Just let that sink in for a minute. 12,000 men. The battle was several hours, but losing 12,000 men in just several hours is quite a stark reality. Confederates lost 13,000. It was considered a costly victory for the North, and this is one of those instances where McClellan had seized the day. His side won, but he did not go in for the kill. The Battle of Antietam is considered the bloodiest battle in American history. More troops died at the Battle of Antietam than the Revolutionary War, the Mexican-American War, and the War of 1812 combined, just in this one battle. The Battle of Shiloh was fought at Shiloh Church in Tennessee, which was just this log cabin church kind of in the wilderness. It was a Confederate surprise attack. Grant knew that the Southern troops were in the area. He just figured that they would meet up the day after, but they decided to meet up and surprise the Union while they were still sleeping in their tents. It's considered a Union victory. Both sides claimed victory in this case, but the Confederates took considerable losses. So again, back to our last slide when we talked about the Union being able to incur more casualties than the South. Every time the South loses men, they're getting that much closer to defeat. So Grant pretty much won the day simply for that reason. The Battle of Shiloh. You need to know that the Battle of Shiloh helped the North gain greater control of the Mississippi River Valley. The Siege of Vicksburg. This is where Grant, he's winning in the West, and now after the Siege of Vicksburg, Grant's stature and reputation really start to take off and people take notice. Vicksburg was fought in Vicksburg, Mississippi. It's right along the Mississippi River. The city itself it's on a hill overlooking a cliff, so it's very difficult to attack. The defenders have the high ground, so therefore Grant decided to lay siege to the city in May of 1863. Sick and hungry, the Confederates surrendered on July 4th, 1863, and this was a key victory for the Union. Grant is quoted as saying, "As Vicksburg goes, so does the Confederacy. So once the Confederates lose Vicksburg, um, it's just another nail in the coffin uh, towards their defeat. I wanted to address the Battle of Gettysburg separate because it is such a pivotal moment in the war. After Gettysburg, the North starts to really gain momentum, and the South becomes a purely defensive strategy. Lee never goes into the North again. So let's start with the first day. The battle begins on July 1st, 1863. Lee does not know where the Union forces are, but he asks a raiding party to go into the little town of Gettysburg for boots and supplies. That party meets General Meade and his cavalry. They push him back into the city of Gettysburg, which is on a hill and a ridge known as Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge. Lee, knowing he's losing the high ground, on the second day he tries to take Little Round Top, just south of Cemetery Ridge, and after fierce fighting, that was unsuccessful. The Union troops secured that, and now they started digging in defensive trenches and other protections. By the third day, the Union troops had the solid position. They were well entrenched, and this is where General Longstreet tried to convince Lee to withdraw and not continue this battle, but Lee thought that he could break the Union line in the center. So he has General Pickett charge with 15,000 men. This charge was a disaster, and the Union is going to go on to win this battle. It's a resounding victory. Lee, devastated, says, "It is all my fault." As I said before, Gettysburg is a turning point in the war. Lee will never launch an attack in the North again. The Union victory at Gettysburg happens on the same day that Grant takes Vicksburg. So the writing is kind of on the wall. The hourglass has begun to run out. On November 19, 1863, President Lincoln gives a speech known as the Gettysburg Address, which he praises the courage of the Union soldiers, and he renews the commitment to win the war. Unfortunately, the war is going to drag on for another 2 years, and eventually on April 9th, 1865, the Union and the Confederate leaders are going to meet in Appomattox, Virginia, at Appomattox Courthouse, where Grant has Lee surrounded. Lee sees the writing on the wall, and he offers terms for surrender. Grant will later write about the experience at Appomattox, saying that he really appreciated and respected such a valiant foe, even though they fought for such the worst thing you could ever fight for, enslaving people. I hope that this was a enlightening and educational video. This was my first. I'm totally learning as I go here. Please remember that I did not touch on everything. This would have been a very long video. You're going to need to know things like the Emancipation Proclamation, 54th Massachusetts, the all-black Union Regiment. So be sure to look into those things as well. And the book I used for majority was the Holt United States History. This is what it looks like. You can probably buy that on Amazon. I will link some supplemental materials down below. And let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.